Right, well, here we go. Good evening, everyone. We'll just give you a chance to come on live here. It is our pleasure to be sitting down with Jacob Mchangama from Denmark. So I can just see a few people are joining us, which is fantastic. We've had obviously a lot of interest in this event over the past couple of weeks as we've been leading up to it. Jacob, it's fantastic to get to sit down with you. As I've been reading through your book, I've genuinely been very interested and looking forward to this chat. So thank you for making the time for us. It's much earlier in your day in Denmark than it is for us. You're starting your day, but for us, hopefully our listeners are sitting back with a cup of tea and are ready to participate in this discussion. And we do invite whether you're watching on our Facebook page or in our webinar. Unfortunately, if you're on our podcast, it won't be possible, but on our other platforms, feel free to send in some questions. We'll be here for the next hour or so. So you can contact me, jonathan@fsu.nz, send in some of your questions and we'll get to put them to Jacob as well. But Jacob, this evening, we're gonna be unpacking your new book, which quite praise to have been given. It's been called the free speech book of the decade, and very prominent free speech advocates like Nadine Strozen, Jonathan Rausch, Stephen Pinker have all said it's exactly what we need in this space right now. So can we just start off with a high level? Why is it that you came at this point now to write about the history of free speech?
Yeah, hi Jonathan. Thanks so much for inviting me to do this chat. I've been looking forward to it. Apologies for the lighting. I look like a James Bond villain on my camera. I think in many ways, you know, from one point of view, you could argue that we're living in sort of a golden age of free speech compared to centuries ago, in the sense that free speech is a constitutionally protected norm in many countries. It's a principle of international human rights law even. And, you know, just technology, the fact that you're sitting on the other side of the world from me and we're having this discussion with no censorship, no inquisition is obviously something which has boosted free speech enormously. But even with the ubiquity of speech and the legal protections, I argue in the book that we're actually sort of at the end of the golden age. We're in a free speech recession. So for more than a decade, free speech has been in decline around the globe. And what I think is perhaps most worrying is that liberal open democracies contribute to this free speech recession. So in a number of Western countries, I suspect this may also be true in New Zealand, but I'm not an expert. But certainly in Europe, we see that increasingly laws are being adopted to restrict free speech, especially online free speech. So on social media, which has caused what I call elite panic in government, but also we see an erosion of the culture of free speech, which arguably is even more important than the legal norms, because if you don't have a robust culture of tolerance, then even strong legal protections are going to erode. And we see that with calls from both the right and the left to sort of cancel and deplatform persons and ideas that they don't like. We see it on the increasing tendencies of social media platforms to restrict their terms of service and filter more and more speech. So that's why I wrote this book, which is based on a podcast that on the same topic called "Clear and Present Danger: History of Free Speech." So I've been working on this topic for a number of years. So that's the background of the book, and hopefully people will find some arguments in there and see that many of the things that we're discussing right now are actually sort of recurrent themes throughout the history of free speech.
And I'm excited to get to unpack some of those tonight. You sit as in the middle of a series of speakers that we're running at the moment in midweek conversation settings, and as we talk with other academics or practitioners or politicians, I think there is this general sense of concern for the state of free speech and where we're headed, the direction that it's pointed in. You know, I found your reference; they were my words, but to the pearl clutching of elites across the ages, as information has become more readily accessible. And this isn't the first time with the advent of the internet that we've seen it. Of course, with the printing press, there was an explosion of accessible opinion, the telephone, the radio, of course. You illustrate very aptly that many of the remarks that are currently being made about the effects of social media and digital misinformation have to some extent already been made before, but surely they're not directly comparable. Does the internet and the age of digital communication represent a shift in substance in your mind, or is it just a shift in form?
Well, I think it might actually be too early to tell.
Okay.
But no, obviously, you know, the speed and sort of global and the speed and instantaneous nature of the internet might be a game changer in a certain sense. But I do wonder whether, you know, the printing press was more of a game changer for people than the internet and social media, because, you know, you had, before the internet, you still had the, you know, so you had the telegraph. So suddenly, you know, you could send messages in minutes across the Atlantic that previously would have taken weeks with letters. You had, you know, you had radio, you had TV, and so on. So I think in the printing press might have been more of a game changer, and it certainly, you know, the disruptions that we're going through right now are that's pretty mild stuff compared to what accompanied the explosive cocktail of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation in Europe at the time. And hopefully we won't the disruptions that we're going through won't be as violent and bloody as what happened in Europe at the time.
But when you say the explosive nature of that day, you're not using that figuratively. It was incredibly violent. We think of the religious wars that occurred there, and millions of people died through that period of time. Why do you think it is that we've lost that context, lost that perspective of where we've come from? You know, there's a lot of hysteria in many ways, in my opinion, around the implications of what we're facing. But if we consider other technological changes, we're not looking at the same sort of violent disruptions, at the very least, at this stage.
Well, I think free speech is a very difficult concept for human beings to handle just psychologically. And I think especially in the age of social media where it's available to everyone. So we feel threatened, I think, when we hear people with ideas, express ideas that run counter to our most basic values and sort of to the values that we see as absolutely necessary for social cohesion, and so we become prone to wanting to crack down on free speech, and especially sort of, I think what I term elite panic. It's not that I don't think that it's governments in democratic states don't want sort of to revert to authoritarianism, but what they want to see is some kind of top-down control, some kind of institutional gatekeepers, like in the good old days, where, you know, the public sphere was in practice limited to professional journalists, editors, intellectuals, and politicians, and then ordinary citizens could be allowed access by these gatekeepers if they found that they had a relevant voice, but they were not they didn't have an unmediated direct access to the public sphere in the same way that you can now post this interview directly on various social media platforms and no editor or politician or anyone else has to sort of approve it or edit it and say, oh, is this responsible or irresponsible? Yeah. So I think that's, and then sort of more basically, I just think that, you know, the default human position that we've sort of evolved as a species tends towards intolerance, probably. And that probably was very useful for us for much of our existence. But in sort of complex, diverse, tolerant societies, it becomes a challenge. And so we've developed this really, really useful, precious patch on top of our default position, which is tolerance and free speech, but it needs constantly sort of to be updated in order for our default position not to override it. And I think it's sort of inherent in all of us. And you see that actually with some of the greatest champions of free speech throughout history. They were in favor of free speech, but then they had certain positions, or there were certain things that occurred that made them say, well, on this specific position, free speech should be limited. So in many ways, you know, the battle for sort of principled free speech is probably never going to succeed perfectly, because we're all prone to want to limit and censor people, but that's why we have to keep waging it all the time, because if we don't, then intolerance is going to win the day.
You know, it's interesting you used an ironic phrase, social cohesion, earlier, and you'll be unaware of why that's ironic, but here in New Zealand, we're having a very extensive conversation around free speech with respect to increasing government censorship. And in the name of social cohesion, quite specifically, the government looked to introduce a new raft of hate speech laws. And we see, while the government has shelved that intention for now due to considerable political pushback, we do see other censorious tendencies emerging. And in the beginning of your book, you quote the Roman historian called Cneius Tacitus, and he wrote, "Laughable indeed are the delusions of those who fancy that by the exercise of their power, posterity can be defrauded of information. On the contrary, through persecution, the reputation of the persecuted talents grows stronger." And nowadays we would call that the Streisand effect, that when you try and shut down information and try and shut down access to it, it just amplifies that. So given the fact that they were talking about this 2,000 years ago, and we're still talking about that now, why do you think it is that governments or influential figures you were referring to all still do feel that censorship will be an effective way of ensuring their power and controlling information?
Well, I think, you know, there's a very powerful dynamic in democracies, and especially probably in our digital age, where politicians have to react and be seen to react instantaneously, and you know, in a media environment where news is around the clock. So if something horrific happens, like the Christchurch attacks, for instance, it's very difficult for a politician to say, this was a horrific effect. Speech contributed to it, extreme ideas contributed to it, but I think it would be better for our open democracy not to crack down on free speech. I think that would be a more effective cure. You know, that's a very, very difficult sell, especially in a population which is rightfully frightened and want to see the government do something about extremists. So you know, you have to be a very brave and very principled politician to sell a message. So it's much easier to say, oh, you know, we are a country that is built on tolerance and respect for minorities. We want to do something about hatred. And what's the most powerfully symbolic way that politicians can do something about hatred? Well, that is to use legislation, that is to ban it. And so that, you know, in many ways, you know, it's a logical way, but it also includes its own sort of nefarious logic, because in the age of social media, it's very, you know, unless you go full Chinese, you won't be able to purge hatred and extremism. They're part of human nature, and it will pop up from time to time. And so if your ambition is that you want to purge the public sphere from all expressions of hatred and all harms and costs of free speech, because let's be honest, there are harms and costs of free speech.
Absolutely.
The individual that responsible for the Christchurch attack, had ideas, and he got those ideas from somewhere, and so speech can inspire horrific deeds. But if you want to purge that, you buy into a logic where you will basically have to increasingly adopt more and more restrictive measures, all the while. I would argue that the history of free speech suggests that it is not, in fact, an efficient, censorship and restriction is not an efficient cure when it comes to intolerance and hatred. And the most sort of vivid example of that might be the Weimar fallacy. So this very prevalent idea in Europe, at least, that the rise of Nazi Germany and ultimately the Holocaust was because the Nazis were allowed to contest democratic elections, were allowed to have newspapers and so on. But in fact, when you look at what happened in the Weimar Republic, there were very draconian laws that were used to censor, radio, that were used to, the government could administratively ban newspapers, and Nazis were frequently the target of censorship and restrictions. And even, these emergency measures that were in the constitution that were supposed to protect democracies were the ones that the Nazis used to abolish free speech.
That's right, yeah.
And so that also points to the danger. So you might, with the best of intentions, say, okay, we're going to adopt these measures in order to keep extremists in check. But what if they gain power? Then you have given them instruments with which they can subvert democracy and target you. And that is something that we've seen throughout history, time and again, unfortunately.
And in her book Hate, Nadine Strozen unpacks that extensively, doesn't she? That almost always, eventually, those measures intended for the benefit of a minority are used against that very minority. In New Zealand, we see not only the government, it's interesting you construct that as a symbol. You said, the government is saying, well, we need to respond to the situation. A symbol will ban it. It plays well politically, but legally and in reality, it's not particularly effective. In New Zealand, we've certainly seen politicians respond that way, but part of the motivation behind it is also the fact that our university is very intent on controlling speech and limiting the use of certain language with the aim of limiting the use of certain ideas. You talk about book burning throughout throughout Europe during the Dark Ages, and you say that really the rise of ecclesiastical censorship resulted in the academy pulling back from what it should have been doing and pressing into some very difficult questions. Just this week, the Free Speech Union will be releasing on Friday research exploring academic freedom in New Zealand. And this is the first time research has been conducted in New Zealand to see how academics feel about their own speech rights. And it's very interesting results. So I'd encourage our listeners to keep an eye out for that on Friday. But how do you think that relationship coexists? We see the university passively responding to their responsibility to promote speech and the government actively censoring it. Which do you think is more pernicious in that? Do you think that self-censorship that occurs in the university in the long run can have more dramatic effects?
Yeah, I think, of course, I'm not familiar with the situation in New Zealand, but I think that ultimately, as I alluded to, the culture of free speech, is ultimately what decides where the legal limits are going to be drawn. And of course, universities play a very important part of the culture free speech. So all those speech norms and practices that are not necessarily regulated or by law and not protected by free speech, but still are absolutely necessary. The same you could say with social media. So Facebook has a right to say that they don't want to host this conversation if they find the topic to be offensive. That's not a violation of free speech as such. But if they said, oh, we're no longer going to allow discussions on free speech, then that would in practice have serious consequences for the exercise of free speech around the globe. And certainly universities who cannot, let's be honest, function without a commitment to free speech and academic freedom, if they start internalizing the idea that free speech is dangerous and that only certain ideas form part of the orthodoxy and that unorthodox ideas must be policed, I think that is a dangerous development and one that we've seen again and again. And it's interesting. I don't know the situation in New Zealand, but if you look at the United States, where this phenomenon is also playing out, you have a considerable pressure from sort of the progressive liberal left to police speech. But if you go back 100 years, lots of people on the left were heavily censored. Right. So, for instance, at Columbia University in 1917, you had 2 professors that were fired for their peaceful opposition to involvement in American involvement in World War I. And Columbia was praised in the New York Times for firing these 2 professors because they said that academic freedom didn't protect poisonous teachings and radicalism and socialism. At Harvard University, the same socialist lecturers were put under considerable pressure due to their ideas. So this just shows that the orthodoxy can change, and so unless you create that culture of free speech at universities where you invite disagreement, then these outbreaks of moral panic can have serious consequences.
And it's easier for those involved in the fight for free speech to turn their minds on legislation or on specific acts, because that's far more tangible, isn't it? So a lot of our energy gets focused on these tangible aspects, where the more ambiguous cultural components are probably more influential at the end of the day. Is that part of why you did a podcast on this, or what do you do to try and influence and educate in terms of that culture around free speech?
Yeah, so I'm trained as a lawyer, so I'm very much started out thinking that the laws were what really mattered and where we draw the line. So it was only really through studying free speech that I started thinking more about the importance of the culture of free speech. But you see it very clearly in John Stuart Mill, for instance, in On Liberty. He talks about how the tyranny of the majority and its tendency to impose its views on dissenters can be as dangerous and as tyrannical as the tyranny of the magistrate.
Yeah.
Alexis de Tocqueville says the same thing. He writes his famous treatise on democracy in America, and he notices how there's no censorship really in official censorship in the U.S. People can write what they say, and that to a very large degree that protects free speech. But if you cross majority opinion, then you subject yourself to sort of persecution, and that can sort of finish you off in ways that are more consequential than if you were put in prison. And of course, then you have other, private threats to free speech. The most extreme, of course, being sort of violence. So whether it's sort of jihadists trying to enforce blasphemy norms, or sort of disrupting speeches, and all of that, I think, is incredibly important to focus on. But it's also, when it comes to the culture of free speech, as you rightly mentioned, it's often more difficult to draw the clear line, because private social media platform is not bound by human rights norms. So free speech norms does not legally apply. So where do you draw the line? That's not an easy answer. The same, and it's also true that you don't have a right to have an op-ed published in the New York Times, and of course criticism, even withering criticism, is also part of free speech. And some, I think, have taken the idea of cancel culture too far, in sort of insisting that, if people say nasty things about me on Twitter, or they react angrily to my opinions, that's cancel culture. Well, no, that's not cancel culture. It might not be sort of live up to the finest norms of debate, but being subjected to angry tweets is not cancel culture. That's part of free speech, being subjected to nasty comments and reactions. And then I think there's also a danger. I see that, especially in the US, in that Jonathan Haidt famously says that morality binds and blinds. So I think there's also a tendency. So if you're, for instance, particularly worried about the woke aspects of the culture of free speech, then there's a tendency among some to say, well, then we have to adopt speech restrictive measures to crack down on the threat from the woke, which is no different from those on the progressive side who want to crack down on racism through hate speech laws. So that's a danger, and I think to a certain extent the problem here is that when we talk about social cohesion, free speech is not a particularly it's not a principle that binds us together in the same way that nationalism or religion can really bind people together. Sort of, I would probably think that most of you and your listeners, feel more strongly about your national identity as Kiwis than you do about the abstract principle of free speech. That's what binds you together as a nation. That's what would, only in certain situations can free speech really, it's typically when you're under attack, when you're being censored. Free speech can be sort of this glue that binds us together and provides us identity. But then, when that struggle is won, then suddenly free speech amplifies all our differences, and then it becomes corrosive to the social cohesion. So in that sense, it's a difficult principle. Of course, the bad thing about national identity and religion is that social cohesion is important, and I think patriotism is a good thing, but it can also become malign. So sort of national chauvinism or religious fundamentalism, sort of the sort that we see Russians being subjected to right now through state propaganda, and then it becomes a threat in and of itself to free speech.
Of course, the old maxim says free speech is not what you give your friends, it's what you give your enemies. And so what you're pointing out there is that well, you may be extending an olive branch of sorts to your enemy, but your enemy he still is, and so there's not much of an alliance there per se. You refer a bit there to religious fundamentalism, and of course there are incidences in the West that we can point to, the Charlie Hebdo attack, the Salman Rushdie case, but certainly in comparison to the Middle Ages, censorship doesn't feature in the same way. And you defined heresy in the Middle Ages as an opinion chosen by human perspectives contrary to Holy Scripture, publicly avowed and obstinately defended. And you summarize this as an active choice to persist with an unsanctioned belief. And so while the direct reference to Holy Scripture may not be relevant today, in the West, whether it be regarding questions of gender or sexuality or race or colonialism, there are definitely quasi-religious conversations. There's a sense of them being quite sacred in the midst of some minds. Is this a modern form of heresy, do you think, which in centuries past would have been censored? What do you think the Middle Ages has to teach us in the way that they dealt with heresy and came through that period of time?
Yeah, I think there are definitely flavors of heresy in that. And again, it's because, you know, if you have certain ideas that you think are absolutely, you know, are beyond question and are those without which no good society can persist, then it becomes dangerous to allow those who challenge those ideas to express them openly. And so in the Middle Ages, even though the Middle Ages were not as dark and devoid of reason as we once thought, there were also sort of very promising developments pointing towards free speech. But you know, the medieval Inquisition is an attempt to impose orthodoxy and ensure that people with the wrong, dangerous, heretical ideas should not be allowed to corrode society. And I think, you know, those, if you were an inquisitor, you did not see yourself as someone who is, you know, as we might look on them today, as evil. You were fighting the good fight, because you know, if you allowed heretics to spread their ideas, that might ultimately provoke God into, you know, divine retribution, and it would also risk not only the souls and eternal life of the heretic, but also those whom the heretic convinced of heretical ideas. And so if you hold those beliefs, then it's easier to understand why the fight against heresy was given such prominence. And you know, the same today. If you are absolutely convinced that systematic racism disfigures Western societies, and that the expression of certain ideas perpetuates and entrenches unequal power relations, entrenching white supremacy, then you can perhaps better understand why such persons think it's a moral necessity to crack down on these expressions that entrenches unequal power relations. Of course, I would argue that the history of free speech shows the very opposite. I would argue that free speech might be, in fact, you know, the most powerful engine of human equality that we've ever stumbled upon as a species, and has always been one of the most important tools for all oppressed groups and minorities when staking a claim for equality and tolerance and acceptance. So I think it's deeply misguided. But you know, if you want to understand why people hold some of those ideas, it's not necessarily because, you know, they're evil or authoritarian. It might actually be because they hold moral beliefs that they feel so strongly about. Of course, it might also mix with, you know, with sheer willingness to just use power. You know, motivations might be mixed, and certainly being able to control speech, it gives you a lot of power. So a lot of people might not have pure principles. It might be a mix.
Of course, the converse of that empathetic moralizing, which perhaps could be construed as heresy in some ways, is a very realist perspective. And you quote the famed realist Machiavelli, longing to see a golden age restored where, quote, everyone could hold and defend whatever opinion he pleased. And at a certain level, if you know anything about Machiavelli, that's an ironic statement in a way. He may have said that he didn't necessarily operate out of that in many ways, but a more enlightened contemporary of his, Erasmus, also claimed that in a free state, tongues should be free too. In a modern day, when the fears of implication of free speech amplified by the internet are rising yet again, what do you think these two individuals that were part of the printing press and the wars we were talking about before, what do you think they can teach us?
I think Machiavelli, he talks about republicanism. I think his is a very sort of utilitarian take on free speech. So that in many ways it's just simply useful in a republican commonwealth to have some certain amounts of free speech. But I don't think it's. I certainly don't think
it's not a principled dedication.
A principled dedication, and I think he would probably have been quite willing to sacrifice it if someone's ideas threatened the Republican Commonwealth. Erasmus, of course, was a prolific writer. Few could rival his output, and he talks of he quotes. I think he uses that quote. He quotes some unnamed Roman emperor, but then at the same time, just a few years later, he says, he complains about the printing press, about all these books that are being churned out and that, publish all these mad, heretical, dangerous ideas. So it's a good example of what I call Milton's curse in the book, of these people who, on the one hand, support free speech, but then say, well, now free speech has gone too far, or on this specific topic, free speech should be restricted.
Often when we come to free speech, as you've already raised tonight, it's not a question by any means of left or right. Politically, both the left and right have been all too willing to use authoritarian measures, and at times have also been the advocates of free speech. I found it interesting when you were unpacking the history of censorship during the Reformation and the Tudor monarchies in Britain. You noted there were similarities between Catholic and Protestant censorship, but a defining difference was the fact that Catholic censorship sought to control every word and thought, to create more pure beliefs, as it were, whereas Protestant censorship was more piecemeal, seeking to limit the potential of harm in thought. And I wondered, do you think there are some parallels to maybe the wokeism that we see here today, where it's not just about controlling harmful thought, it's actually about creating more pure thought. It's about it goes back to that question of moralizing you were talking about before, where the woke actually wants to create a more empathetic, compassionate, equal way of thinking, not just stop bad ways of thinking.
I haven't actually given that much thought. I think it's important, when you talk about the Tudor, the difference between Catholic and Protestant censorship was specifically, focused on England. So if you went to other Protestant European states, censorship might have been as draconian as in Catholic states. Certainly my home country, Denmark, had very, very draconian censorship as a Lutheran state for a long time. And Luther himself came around to the idea that sort of blasphemers should be executed. But I think we can. What is the definition of wokeism? Probably very, very different ones. But I think it's true that in the sense that people who have a sort of a very ideological worldview will tend to believe in more comprehensive control of speech, because they want the world to conform to their ideology. And so, a good example of that, of course, is communism. And so I don't, I think that under Stalin, it's rivaled by the current and maybe exceeded by the level of censorship in China, and we can discuss whether China is a real communist state or not. But censorship under Stalin's in the Soviet Union under Stalin is probably the most systematic repressive regime of censorship ever devised. And that, of course, was deeply ideological. So that was an insistence that the world conform to communist ideology, and anyone whose ideas challenged that would have to be silenced. And then there were different ways of doing that, from sort of banning books to putting you in prison to sending you to a gulag, or ultimately a bullet in the back of the head.
Yeah. Your reference to Denmark there is interesting in terms of the experience that Lutheran states had as well. In New Zealand, the majority government, well, we have a system which shouldn't really be giving majority governments, and the Prime Minister was so popular at the last election, they had the capacity to bring in really whatever law they wanted. You note in your book that Denmark, your homeland, was the first nation in the world to remove all censorship completely. In 1770. Even today, virtually all Western liberal democracies, though, have some form of censorship in place. And we accept that very few people are free speech absolutists. Almost everyone respects that there is a certain amount of speech that shouldn't be allowed. So in comparison to Denmark, it's a striking example. However short-lived it was, you also unpack that that was not the case for quite some time. While your understanding of New Zealand would be limited, generally, what do you think is the right balance between free speech absolutism, which we might say a la Danish state in the 18th century, and the increasingly regressive censorist tendencies of so-called liberal democracies like the United Kingdom or Canada or New Zealand? Do you think there's a way for us to navigate in a more balanced way between these two extremes?
Yeah, and of course, the Danish situation in 1770 was very particular in the sense that it was an absolutist monarchy, and then our king at the time, King Christian VII, was there's no other way to put it, but batshit crazy. So he probably suffered from schizophrenia or something, and then he had a German physician who was a radical Enlightenment supporter, who not only bedded the Queen, but also basically took over power and just abolished censorship overnight. And when overnight you abolish censorship in an absolutist monarchy, which was also sort of a Lutheran state, then that is certain to give rise to a lot of division and very difficult principle to handle. But I think when it comes to the legal limits on free speech, there are all kinds of concrete harms that I think most people would agree should not be covered by free speech. Sort of fraud or forgery are examples. I think most people would also tend to agree that direct incitement to violence and terrorism should not be covered by free speach.
Defamation and libel as well.
Yeah, and then but which is a difficult category, because where do you draw the line on defamation and libel? Because defamation and libel laws can, if they're drafted in ways where sort of very intangible harms to reputation are covered, then they can really be a disincentive to free speech. On the other hand, that many people might also agree that if I were to write an article accusing you of being a rapist, then it would be fair if I would actually was able to substantiate it, and if not, then you could take action against me. So I don't think, is it possible to give sort of a clear line on where to draw the line? I don't think so, but I would say that what I'm particularly concerned about is safeguarding viewpoint diversity. So basically, any viewpoint peacefully expressed should be protected by free speech. So that means even if you're a Nazi and an apologist for the Holocaust, I would say that you should have free speech. I would not grant you free speech if you were to stand outside a synagogue and say, let's go and get the Jews.
Well, and a question that we've had come in here, which I think relates to that in a way, is about the current war in the Ukraine and Russian propaganda. We've had quite a few of our supporters contact us with regards to a decision that a large media outlet here in New Zealand, Sky TV, chose to take down RT, Russia Today, and that has been echoed by many Western nations, removing what almost objectively and demonstrably is a mouthpiece of the Russian state. What are your thoughts on that, though? Because I think there's an argument to be made that even though it is a mouthpiece of the Russian government, the principles of free speech say that the bad ideas are beaten by good ideas and allow them to reveal themselves, and it will be to their demise. Do you think that there is credence in that, or do you think in war we're playing by a different set of games? And of course, you're much closer to the implications of this war than we are here in New Zealand.
Yeah, no, and the EU has actually gone further. So in the European Union, sort of almost overnight, adopted a regulation saying not only that Sputnik and RT were no longer allowed to broadcast, but also that Google should remove all searches of RT content, that social media platforms should block users from spreading content, even if you wanted to debunk Russian propaganda. And I think that's a serious and dangerous own goal. So one thing is sort of the principled question, should bureaucrats in Brussels be allowed, to define what is propaganda and disinformation and ban content on that basis? You could quickly see that could be abused in the future. Now, do state-owned Russian media have a strong free speech protection? Perhaps not. But then on the other hand, does it then follow then that states around the world should be able to ban the BBC or Deutsche Welle or France 24? I think most people would say no, that would not be a good idea. That would rob people in illiberal democracies from alternative views. And ultimately, I think what these actions show is that they portray citizens in democracies as these gullible simpletons who are prone to be manipulated by the Russian state. But the very politicians who make these decisions derive their power and legitimacy from the people that they want to rob, that they apparently don't trust enough to be able to sort propaganda from the truth. And when you look at it, in the West, Russian propaganda has failed miserably. I don't know what the situation is in New Zealand, but certainly in Western Europe, supporters and apologists for Putin are few and far between. Most people have yellow and blue flags on their social media profiles.
Even in New Zealand as well.
Yeah, and so in that sense, I think that really shows the strength of free speech, that we can actually beat Russian propaganda based on liberal and open principles. And also, I think in a certain sense, sort of the open source intelligence community on social media has really done great work in sort of debunking Russian propaganda almost in real time, sort of using sophisticated methods to show and demonstrate, you know, atrocities and why Russian narratives are lies. And that is, you know, that is in actual fact free speech being used to counter the harms of propaganda. And I think that's something that we should, you know, really celebrate in a way, that our principles are actually being used, put to practice against an increasingly totalitarian state whose own citizens are being fed a diet of propaganda and censorship. And also, you know, it gives to the few Putin apologists out there, Western censorship of Russian media gives them sort of whataboutery points. So they can say, oh, well, what's the difference between Putin and the European Union? Because the European Union, even though, of course, there's no comparison between the degree of censorship of Russian media and the censorship in Russia, where you can go to prison for 15 years if you spread so-called propaganda or false information, and false information calling the war a war. You know, 15,000 people or more have been arrested for protesting the war on the streets of Russia. And also, you know, it gives Putin you know, a certain legitimacy in his own crackdown. He can say, well, yeah, well, RT and Sputnik are being banned in the European Union, so we're just going to do the same here. And so I think in that sense, it's also it plays into the hands of authoritarian states when open democracies respond in that matter. And also, you know, I just don't see any evidence that it's an effective way or that it does any good. I certainly know, I think the situation in Ukraine is very different. Everyone can understand that the Ukrainians are now fighting for their lives, and that free speech cannot be upheld within Ukraine, which is actually at war. And of course, they need to control information in ways that are incompatible with democracy, and you can understand why they want to shut down Russian propaganda, why they want to have stringent controls on what can be said, so as not to sort of disclose troop movements and so on. They are in an actual state of emergency. They are at war. We might in the West increasingly be supporting the Ukrainians, but our politicians are very clear that we're not at war. And in fact, none of us are facing, not currently at least, the threat that the Ukrainians are in. So I don't think the conditions for restricting free speech in wartime are met in Western democracies.
Someone picked up on the comment that you made a little while ago, just around the low expectations almost that politicians have of their people at times, in terms of their capacity to evaluate information and assess it correctly. Do you think there is a poverty of low expectations that perhaps even comes through our education system, where if we allowed people to assess themselves, it would actually develop more critical thinking and robust discussion around these complex issues?
Yeah, I think education certainly has a huge role to play, and I'm not an expert on how, but I think in general, free speech advocates should do more to demonstrate the benefits of free speech and access to information, rather than solely focusing on calling out restrictions on free speech and referring to abstract principles. Of course, these principles are not very abstract. They can be very concrete for the persons that are being subjected to them, and they can have very concrete downstream effects. But I think that free speech advocates need to do a better job at actually demonstrating why free speech matters, why, you know, sort of, as I mentioned, how people on social media use access to information and free speech to debunk propaganda, how counter speech can be used against hate speech and so on. So I think that when you have those specific and concrete examples, that might be more efficient in countering attempts, sort of knee-jerk reactions of elite panic by governments in restricting free speech, rather than simply saying, oh, we shouldn't ban extreme hatred because it didn't work against the Nazis. I think that's, as someone who uses that argument, I think it's an important argument, but it's probably, at the heat of the moment, unlikely to sway politicians who want to be seen as doing something about extremism.
Kind of going back to where this conversation started, you were talking about the shift that is occurring in the West, and in your book you claim that the global club of democracies is shrinking fast, and if you cite Viktor Orban and Modi in India, and obviously Russia is again an apt example. From my perspective, many of us in the West, I think we view such regressions with an element of indifference. There's almost we take for granted the liberties that we do enjoy. But you also claim that liberal democracies like the West pursuing increasingly centrist tendencies. You call this free speech entropy. Why is it, do you think, that the West is falling afoul to free speech entropy? Why are Canada and the United States and Australia and New Zealand and Northern European nations, why are they losing ground to what arguments that we've come across time and time again in the past and have prevailed against?
Yeah, no. So some of the reasons are what I mentioned, sort of elite panic, and especially in the digital era, sort of the unmediated access of the masses to social media, the ability to spread disinformation and extreme speech, sort of is a loss of control on behalf of institutions and politicians, which induces fear. So I think that's one of the reasons. But another is something that you just alluded to, namely the fact that I think many of us take free speech for granted. So few of us have fought for free speech. A few of us have experienced living under authoritarian rule. So it's almost unimaginable to us that our right to free speech should be taken away. And so we don't worry about a few extremists being censored, perhaps because we don't imagine that it could happen to us. And we don't see that, in the words of John Stuart Mill, that if free speech is not good for an extreme case, then it's no good in any case. So I think that the fact that we take it for granted, that it's something like breathing the air in open democracies, unfortunately means that we've become blasé about it. We don't appreciate its value to the same extent that people who have lived under authoritarian states do, and also we don't imagine that it can have really bad long-term consequences if we just tinker around the edges of free speech and sort of cut the grass now and then when extremists become too loud.
I wanted to end on a note of hope, and we haven't quite gotten there yet. It still seems a somewhat bleak situation for free speech in many ways, and I appreciate those last comments you made there. I grew up in a post-communist state. I grew up in Mozambique, was educated in Kenya, and what really interests me about your book was references to the non-Western world and their engagement with free speech that so many of us are unaware of. So of course you considered extensively Islamic thought and the Mongol Empire and other examples there. Do you think the non-Western world may prove to be the savior of free speech in a way, in an era where the West is experiencing free speech entropy? Do you think some of these other African, South American, Asian nations that in the past have not been connected to our concepts of Western enlightenment still appreciate the value of free speech and may celebrate it in coming decades in ways the West won't?
Well, that's a good question. I think that certainly, if you look at the South African courts, for instance, their definition of hate speech is quite interesting. So even though the last decision by the Constitutional Court went in the wrong direction, but in general, I think the apartheid past means that the courts in South Africa are, look at history in a way where they see the dangers of censorship and repression, just because apartheid and white supremacy rested on such extreme degrees of censorship and repression. So they are much more concerned about the dangers of laws restricting free speech, even against extremism, than say the European Court of Human Rights. So I think there's that at least is an interesting development. I would also look, a country like Taiwan, I think is experimenting a lot with digital solutions that might further free speech and create new platforms that sort of enhance rather than erode trust in institutions. So I think there's something to take away from that. But I still think, when you look at attitudes towards free speech at a global level, the West is still where the support is the strongest. So I still think that we need to rely heavily on sort of the Western heartland to keep up free speech, even if free speech historically is not solely a Western value. And you have people like Gandhi and others who have contributed to free speech and upheld conceptions of free speech that were vastly more free speech protected than what was the norm in the West at the time.
Well, Jacob, thank you so much for your time this evening for us. If I can just encourage our viewers this evening, in terms of education and the importance of understanding the arguments for free speech, you will struggle to do better than Free Speech, History, Socrates to Social Media, which Jacob has just released now. And I'll repeat myself somewhat here. The international recognition and praise that this volume has received has been considerable. And so I would really encourage, if you are looking for a new book to get into Jacob's Free Speech. But for now, thank you so much for your time. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us again tonight. We'll be sitting down next week with Dr. Michael Johnston from the New Zealand Initiative and Michael Shaw. So I hope you'll join us then. But for now, thank you so much, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks for everyone who spent their evening with me. So all the best.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.